One of the deepest patterns in Russian history is not just size, invasion, or autocracy. It is control over what can be known. Again and again, rulers and ruling systems tried to monopolize the story as tightly as they monopolized force. That is why a secret history of Russia is not just a list of strange forgotten events. It is a history of power hiding reality from subjects, rivals, and sometimes the wider world. If you follow that thread, very different periods begin to look connected by one habit. When the facts threatened authority, the facts themselves became targets. A striking early example comes from Muscovy under Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. Popular memory often reduces him to personal cruelty, but the deeper significance of his reign lies in the machinery of fear and narrative control he built. Through the Oprichnina in the 16th century, Ivan carved out a domain loyal to himself, unleashed terror against boyar elites and whole communities, and normalized the idea that a ruler could name internal enemies and reorder the country through confiscation and violence. The massacre of Novgorod became famous not only for bloodshed, but for the way accusation, treason panic, punishment, and selective storytelling fused together. That pattern matters because the hidden traitor narrative never really disappeared from Russian political culture. If the ruler can declare that danger lives inside the body of the state, then coercion starts looking like protection. That logic returns again and again in later centuries. A second undertaught phase is the time of troubles at the start of the 17th century. After the death of Tsar Fyodor and the collapse of stable succession, Russia went through famine, impostors claiming to be the dead Tsarevich Dmitry, foreign intervention, elite conspiracy, and near-state failure. The system looked far less sacred and far more fragile than later myth would prefer. The Romanov dynasty that emerged from that chaos inherited more than a throne. It inherited a usable lesson. Strong autocracy saves Russia from ruin. That story was politically valuable because it turned a terrifying breakdown into an argument for central power. In other words, even the memory of collapse could be shaped into a tool of rule. That is one reason secret history matters. It shows not only what happened, but how later regimes organized remembrance so the past would support present authority rather than complicate it. The Soviet period makes the pattern even clearer. One of the most revealing but less widely discussed episodes is the 1937 census. Soviet authorities expected the numbers to validate the triumphs of socialism. Instead, the results reflected demographic devastation from famine, repression, and social upheaval. The officials connected to the census were punished, the results were suppressed, and a new census was organized under more politically acceptable conditions. That story captures Stalin-era logic in miniature. When reality contradicted ideology, the messengers became the problem. The wider landscape around that census includes the famine of 1932 to 1933, the Great Terror, and an information system so intense that millions could suffer while official language still insisted on progress. The classification and interpretation of the famine can still trigger fierce political debate, especially over intent and national targeting. But the broad fact of mass death across parts of the Soviet Union is not seriously in doubt. Archives, memoirs, demographic work, and later scholarship make that clear. The hidden part is not whether people died. The hidden part is how long full public acknowledgement was obstructed, and how deeply silence was built into the system. Katyn is another textbook example. In 1940, thousands of Polish officers and members of the Polish elite were executed by the Soviet secret police. When mass graves were later found, Soviet authorities denied responsibility and blamed Nazi Germany. That lie lasted for decades in official discourse. Katyn matters not only because of the killings themselves, but because it shows the scale of a state-backed falsehood that could be enforced through censorship, diplomacy, and propaganda against forensic reality. It is hard to understand the politics of memory in the region without understanding how long a lie like that could be maintained. The Cold War brought more cases of the same instinct. The 1957 Kyshtym disaster, a major nuclear accident in the Urals, stayed secret for years. Whole communities were exposed or displaced under conditions of limited information. In 1960, the Nedelin catastrophe killed large numbers of people in a missile explosion at Baikonur, yet the public story concealed the real cause. Even after Stalin, the Soviet system kept treating information as a strategic weapon rather than a public good. Disaster management and narrative management were often fused together. Then came Chernobyl in 1986. The reactor explosion was historic, but so was the sequence of denial, delay, minimization, and forced disclosure that followed it. Radiation does not respect censorship, and that was part of the problem. The state's inability to contain the narrative became part of the larger legitimacy crisis that weakened the Soviet system in its later years. Chernobyl mattered not only because it was a catastrophe, but because it exposed how dangerous secrecy becomes when physical reality leaks past official language and starts speaking for itself. What ties these very different episodes together is that secrecy was rarely accidental. It was infrastructural. From dynastic myth and court intrigue to statistical falsification, police terror, archival closure, and disaster concealment. Rulers repeatedly acted as if controlling the story was one of the core technologies of rule. Tsarist, Soviet, and post-Soviet systems are not identical, and their differences matter. But each wrestled with the same basic question: who gets to define patriotic truth, treason, memory, and permissible mourning? That is why this secret history has present-day relevance. Debates over archives, textbooks, Stalin's legacy, wartime memory, and the language used to describe repression are not side arguments. They continue a long struggle over whether the state exists to reveal history, curate it, or weaponize it. The hidden parts of Russia's past were often hidden on purpose. Powerful people understood that if citizens saw the full record clearly, the official version of power would become much harder to sustain. In that sense, secrecy was not just a cover. It was part of the architecture, if you want more history where the battle over facts matters. As much as the events themselves, stay with this channel. Sometimes the most revealing story is not only what happened, but who needed the record to stay blurred afterward.